After Rocky and Rambo reached their peak in 1985 with Rocky IV and Rambo First Blood Part 2, Sylvester Stallone gave us yet another badass character to root for the next year in 1986, one with sequel potential galore that unfortunately has not been fulfilled, and that man was named
Marion Cobra. Is that really his name?
Cobra's roots are pretty interesting. The movie was beyond loosely based on the novel by Paula Gosling, Fair Game. Funny enough, another cinematic adaptation of the same novel was pumped out in 1995 starring William Baldwin and Cindy Crawford. And guess what? It totally sucked!
Back up!
Or what?
Or I'll take your goddamn head off!
Shit!
The bulk of Cobra's meat, insert generic sex joke here,
I'd be sick not to want to sleep with you.
came from Stallone's work on Beverly Hills Cop. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester Stallone was originally cast as Axel Foley. But once he read the script, he took it upon himself to change the main character's name from Foley to Cobretti, and he axed out most of the comedy while the visceral action set pieces were doubled down on. The latter would have jacked up the budget, so Sly and Paramount, who didn't really care for what Sly was doing with the project, parted ways. Although apparently all involved said that Sly was a total gentleman about it, and they actually cast his wife, Bridget Nielsen, in Beverly Hills Cop 2 because his relationship with them was so strong. So Eddie Murphy, of course, took on the role of Axel Foley, and the rest is, as they say, cinematic history. I mean, who else could play Axel Foley but Eddie Murphy? It was meant to be.
Disturbing the peace, I got thrown out of a window. What's the fucking charge for getting pushed out of a moving car, huh? Jaywalking?
But Sly's ideas did not go to waste. He wound up repurposing his Beverly Hills Cop material into a new script. Named after John Wayne, whose birth name was actually Marion Robert Morrison, Marion Cobretti, aka Cobra, was born. The film was shot on a pretty sizable budget for 1986, $25 million, and it was co-financed by Cannon Films and Warner Brothers. You see, there's no way Cannon Films could have afforded a $25 million Sylvester Stallone movie. I'm sure that they needed Warner Brothers' help to pay his salary.
I was paying attention to business.
Me too, I didn't notice.
Of course, they would pay him a ton of money for Over the Top, but it wouldn't end so well for Cannon, even though the film itself, in my opinion, is a bit of a classic.
I'm through talking.
So Cobra tells the rather heartfelt tale of an army of axe-wielding serial killers led by the Night Slasher, chillingly played by Brian Thompson, who spend their nights terrorizing LA, carving up folks. Oh yeah, and it's set at Christmas. A heartwarming Christmas tale for all. When a fashion model with ludicrously long legs, played by Stallone's then-wife Bridget Nielsen, happens to see the face of their leader, she becomes a target with the Notsos stopping at nothing to waste her. Oh, and along the way they kill David Rashi, aka Sledgehammer, who plays her sleazy photographer. Fear not. A man among men has been assigned to protect the lady. Armed with his slick trench coat, a matchstick in his mouth, a slew of macho one-liners, and some aviators, and a hot car, a custom 1950 Mercury, which was actually Stallone's own car with the amazing license plate Awesome 50, plus a myriad of amazing firearms, Cobra does the human laundry old school, because crime's a disease.
On the cure.
Thank you so much for watching Sylvester Stallone Revisited. If you like this type of content, make sure to click on the like button as well as the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. Now back to the show.
Clean up your act.
Chinga tu madre, pinche joto! Yes!
Opening with a close-up of the Cobra design on Sly's gun and his raspy, "In America," monologue.
A murder every 24 minutes.
Oh, I knew I was in for a badass macho ride when I first popped this in as a kid. Funny enough, the first time I ever babysat myself, I rented Cobra. Because, you know, it's a great movie for kids. The flick on paper is directed by George P. Cosmatos, who I think is an amazing director. But I say on paper because, much like Rambo 2, word has leaked out that Sly perhaps called a lot of the shots on those movies. It all goes back to Kurt Russell's stories about shooting Tombstone with Cosmatos as his quote-unquote director, and him being basically hipped by Stallone to the fact that Cosmatos was kind of amenable to changes being made on set. So, whether or not Cosmatos was the actual director, I don't really know, but he definitely has credit. And the movie does have a lot of Stallone's visual style. If you watch Rocky 4 and then you watch Cobra right afterwards, the movies have a lot in style, like his love of extreme close-ups and his cool, fast-paced MTV aesthetic, which I think Stallone really nailed at the time. So whoever it was that was responsible for what I saw, Stallone or Cosmatos, they deserve a cold beer because this movie is one slick, neon-heavy ride. I love everything about it. It's so 80s, it's so good. I also really like the moodiness of the piece. It's got a nice random noir mood with some heavy horror undertones. I think this is probably the closest Stallone ever got to making a legit horror movie, unless you count, Detox, aka I See You, which came out years and years later. Everything in this movie is so expertly choreographed and executed. I mean, I love this movie, and the action is amazing. So, the original cut of Cobra was apparently 2 hours long, but the film got trimmed down for two reasons. One, it was very violent, to the point that the MPAA slapped it with an X rating, of course, which just wasn't gonna fly for an action film. And of course, Top Gun came out just before this movie did, and it became a massive box office hit.
I am dangerous.
So the powers that be at Warner Brothers got a little bit cockshy, hence they went with a Slim Jim 87-minute running time in the name of having more screenings of the flick a day, hoping to bag more coin. For a while there was a very rare work print of the movie being circulated, but I never managed to get my hands on it. Even Shout Factory's recent 2019 Collector's Edition Blu-ray release of the film fell short in delivering us the missing footage, because it may not actually exist. It feels like the footage is lost, but in Sly we trust. If it's out there, Sly's gonna find it, and he'll find you. I still have hopes that Sly may one day gain access to the original footage and work his magic on it, as he did recently with Rocky 4, and give us the Cobra director's cut we all deserve. Alas, it's just a dream.
She's gonna wreck our new world. End the dream.
That said, the fat-free theatrical cut of the film is still a blast and a half. The first potent bullet in Cobra's canon was without a doubt the character of Cobra himself, who was an amalgam of everything that is manly and tough. I'm talking muscled up, tan like a mofo, slick, oiled up, short on words, and big on cracking skulls. The dude was clearly the 80s version of Dirty Harry.
Do you know you have an attitude problem?
Yeah, but it's just a little one.
And I don't think it was a coincidence that two Dirty Harry alumni, Rennie Santoni, who plays the same role here but with a junk food addiction and a little more humor as Cobra's partner, and Andy Robertson, show up in Cobra. In fact, Andrew Robinson apparently was going to be revealed as the main villain at the end of Cobra, but it didn't happen, and today just gets punched out because he's the annoying police chief that everybody hates.
No hard feelings, pal.
Definitely some severe Dirty Harry connections in this movie. But Cobra goes much further than Dirty Harry in terms of having no boundaries as to what he can do or will do to take out the trash.
You have the right to remain silent.
Think of him as kind of a semi-right-wing superhero with an attitude. No country club prison cells for these clowns. It doesn't get more hardcore in terms of severe brutality and bad guys hitting the gravel hard than in Cobra. And of course, Cobra's squad that he's part of, the zombie squad, tells you everything you need to know. I mean, that's how he considers these bad guys in this movie. Zombies, so he just mows them down.
Just bring a dirt bag.
But it wasn't just the rough and tumble fight sequences that whooped me into a smile frenzy as a kid. No, it was that insane car chase that kicked my ass. All about that 180-degree turn where he shoots the baddies with his machine gun, plus the lengthy suitouts, the various kill methods, or the sight of Cobra in the back of a pickup truck mowing down all kinds of varmints with his nifty automatic weapon, the rare and oh so cool Jadimatic submachine gun. Whenever I see the latter scene, I say to myself, life doesn't get much better than this if you're a hardcore gun nut, which I think Cobra is in the film. Oh, and who could forget the Night Slasher's iconic knife? Designed by Herman Schneider, the weapon was custom made at Sylvester Stallone's request, as he wanted a weapon that audiences would never forget. And well, it sure worked on John Fallon, the guy who writes the series, because have you ever looked closely at the arrow in the head logo? Yes? No? No matter. You see the knife that he's holding? That's the Cobra knife. It's right there. Hashtag never forget.
You have to take me in. If you can.
The final notches on Cobra's Too Cool for School belt were its solid performances all around. Lee Garlington especially gave me the creeps as kind of the Night Slasher's squeeze, Plus, it's got a really good score by Sylvester Stallone and some solid 80s pop rock ditties, including Feel the Heat by Jean Beauvoir. It's also got a love theme that kind of cracks me up with Bill Medley singing it just before he did Time of My Life for Dirty Dancing. Plus, it's got tons of priceless macho dialogue, doozies like,
This is where the law stops, and I start.
And it's ode to Dirty Harry.
Go ahead. I don't shot her.
And of course,
The disease, and I'm the cure.
priceless, my friends, priceless. But it was not meant to be in terms of Cobra getting a sequel. The critics killed this movie, and when it was released, it was actually considered a box office disappointment by the studio, although it did gross over $12 million on its opening weekend, which was the largest opening weekend in the history of Warner Brothers and the Cannon Group at the time. It eventually earned about $160 million worldwide, which on a $25 million budget means that it was a pretty big hit, right? Over the years, the film has gained quite a bit of a cult following with action fans, and even director Nicholas Winding Refn wound up being a huge admirer, hence the Cobra homage in his 2011 thriller Drive. In the latter, the main character pimps a toothpick in his mouth, much like Cobra chewed on a matchstick. All in all, Cobra may not be perfect on paper. It's got some pretty big plot holes, I think probably due to the fact that so much of the film was cut at the 11th hour, but it pushes my right detonation buttons, resulting in one hell of a sit down when I groove with it. They definitely don't make gritty, politically incorrect, and no-holds-barred action thriller slasher movies like this one anymore, that's for damn sure. I saw Cobra many times and have viewed it many times since. Loved it as a kid, love it now. Cobra rules. I pretty much know the entire movie by heart, right down to its musical cues. Feel the heat, feel the heat, feel the heat. So yeah, in my book of bad to the core action flicks, Cobra takes the high octane entertainment cake and shoves it up your yin yang. So strap on them leather gloves, whip out the scissors, and cut that frozen pizza up fervently while cleaning your gun. It's time well spent. I give this 10 out of 10 Stallones.
You know what the trouble with you is? You're too violent. It's all that sugar you're eating. The world meets nobody halfway. Do you understand what that means? If you want it, Mike, you gotta take it.
True story. The first Sylvester Stallone movie that I ever saw was Over the Top. I was something like 5 years old watching the Canadian version of HBO First Choice when onto the screen came this elaborately muscled, oiled up god of a man that I would learn later on was Sylvester Stallone. As a 5-year-old, I have to say, I was blown away by his presence, and, you know, the fact that it was a movie about arm wrestling, I thought was the coolest thing ever. I mean, me and my friends were obsessed with this film. We used to turn our baseball caps around on our heads, you know, and pretend we were Lincoln Hawk and arm wrestle all day long. I never won once. I even had an over-the-top action figure that had a dial on the back that would turn Lincoln Hawk's arm around as if he was arm wrestling. So this movie holds a special place in my heart, even though I can look at it as perhaps a product of its time in ways both good and bad. But in 1987, where was Sylvester Stallone? Well, he was coming off of two of the biggest hits of his career, Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rocky IV, and the year before, in 1986, he had done the movie Cobra, which was the first time he teamed with Cannon Pictures. Cannon Pictures, for those of you that don't know, was run by the Israeli cousins Monahan Golan and Yoram Globus. And if you're a fan of 80s movies, you've no doubt come across that iconic Cannon Films logo. I always loved the music for it. Boom, boom, boom. They were the undisputed kings of 80s B action flicks, with Chuck Norris, Michael Dudikoff, and Sho Kosugi and so many others part of their stable. When I was a kid, Cannon Films meant ninjas, breakdancing, Chuck Norris, Stallone, and all the things that I love. In the mid to late 80s, Cannon Films really had their eyes on a bigger prize than just being the B-movie kings. You see, they wanted to become the next Warner Brothers. And to that end, they signed huge financial deals with some of the biggest stars in Hollywood, including, of course, Sylvester Stallone, because they simply didn't come much bigger than him. Their first film together was Cobra, which was not a typical Cannon movie. Yes, it was definitely an R-rated B action flick, but it had a huge budget, $25 million. And indeed, it was a co-production with a major studio, Warner Brothers.
The disease, and I'll make yours.
It was meant to be a blockbuster, and indeed was a financial success, grossing $48 million at the domestic box office, and about twice that domestically. But it was considered a mild disappointment because Marion Cobretti simply did not become the next Rambo. Even still, Cannon had to be happy. It was one of the biggest hits they'd ever had. And they doubled down on Sly, offering him the highest salary ever paid to a movie star at the time, $12 million, to star in Over the Top.
Can't believe everything you hear.
Thank you so much for watching Sylvester Stallone Revisited. If you like this type of content, make sure to click on the like button as well as the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. Now back to the show. Based on a script by Gary Conway and David Engelbach, the film was pitched as a low-key character-driven drama with the lead earmarked for a guy like Don Johnson. The story of a man trying to win back his estranged son once Sterling Sylvan, the writer of In the Heat of the Night, Poseidon Adventure, Towering Inferno, and 1976's King Kong was brought in, it was pumped up to become an epic Rocky-esque tale, instead of boxing, of course, arm wrestling. So who else could they bring on board but Sylvester Stallone? Well, in the years since, Stallone has kind of downplayed his contribution to the movie, saying that he did it for the money because the salary was insane. The movie really does have all the earmarks of a true Stallone classic, namely the verisimilitude. People have knocked the movie as a Rocky clone with arm wrestling, and sure enough it is to some extent. But Stallone as a co-writer really does take us into the world of arm wrestling, and I think that at the time people didn't consider it a realistic depiction, but it was loosely based on the career of a real trucker class champ named John Brezink. Now to be sure, the adversaries Lincoln Hawk, the character that Stallone plays, face don't look much like actual arm wrestlers, although some of them are the real deal. They're all bodybuilders that are straight out of Gold's Gym and wrestlers. They look like something out of a comic book with the late Rick Zimwalt, the main adversary, Bull Hurley. But a funny thing happened. Over the Top didn't start out as realistic, and many people made fun of it in 1987 for not being realistic at all, but it became realistic over time. The movie was so influential on arm wrestling that if you happen upon an arm wrestling championship on ESPN, it looks like Over the Top. I mean, it's mostly in Vegas, everybody's way over the top to, put a cap on it, and it really does look like the arm wrestlers that are doing it now were all massive fans of Over the Top and patting their careers on it. Over the Top almost seems like a documentary now when compared to arm wrestling, how it really is. So that's pretty amazing. Now, Monahan Golan, who ran Cannon Pictures, wound up directing the movie. Now, does this sound like a terrible idea to you? Actually not that bad of an idea, because you see, he had already directed The Delta Force and was a relatively accomplished director of action films at the time. He had also done Enter the Ninja and a bunch of movies in Israel that were actually fairly well received, such as Operation Thunderbolt. Heavily based on the Rocky films, it's very much an MTV-inspired tale with a lot of, Stallone's hallmarks all over it, making me wonder if he kind of took over in the editing room. It also has a constant rock soundtrack, including a big hit song by Kenny Loggins, Meet Me Halfway, which I loved, and of course Sammy Hagar's Winner Takes It All, Winner Takes It All, plus stylized visuals and a magnificently greased up Sylvester Stallone throughout. But there's more to Over the Top than meets the eye. For one thing, one of the things that always made Sly different than any of the other action stars that we grew up with in the 80s was the fact that while he was tough, muscle-bound, and badass, he was also vulnerable. Over the Top, while arguably cheesy and melodramatic in some ways, tells a solid father and son story that resonated with me when I was a kid.
Like, I'm just a father who messed up pretty bad, I know that. I've done things real wrong. Now I want to try to fix everything up as best I can.
Mostly because as tough as Lincoln Hawk is, you can tell he legitimately loves his child and is not above being emotional or vulnerable. Lincoln Hawk is an eminently human character. He's a deadbeat dad in some ways, pushed away by his overbearing father-in-law played by the legendary Robert Loggia. That's right, R-O-B-E. No, I'm not going to do the whole thing. He allowed the old man and his money to put a wedge between him and his wife, played by Susan Blakely, and took off rather than fight. Yet, like many of us, he's trying to do better, and when his wife becomes terminally ill, he becomes determined to step up and do the right thing. While it's too late to repair his marriage, it's not too late to establish a bond with his kid, Michael, even if he is a bit of a brat when it begins. A military academy kid, Michael worships his grandfather and despises his dad, who he thinks is a low-down drug dealer.
This truck is disgusting.
Luckily, all it takes is some badass arm wrestling lessons and learning how to drive a truck to sort him out. The best scene, and one that made an impression on me as a kid, was when Michael arm wrestles a kid in the dive. He loses and starts to cry, but his dad sets him straight.
I know you can win, but even if you don't, so what? So you lose. As long as you lose like a winner, it doesn't matter, because you did it with dignity.
Winning and losing isn't important. It's taking your victories and failings as a man and giving it real effort that matters. Once he gives the arm wrestling his all and turns around his hat, that's key, he wins. Boom. Done. As much as Sly himself has dissed the movie over the years, it is a great slice of 80s nostalgia. I always had a real soft spot for it, and you can tell that a lot of the dialogue must come straight from Sly, namely the great quote, "The world meets nobody halfway."
The world meets nobody halfway. Do you understand what that means? If you want it, Mike, you gotta take it.
Truer words have never been spoken. Sly, even if he knew he was making something a little cheesy, throws himself into the movie and makes arm wrestling look incredibly badass. Cannon hoped this would be a huge hit and marketed a line of Lincoln Hawk toys. I even owned one. It had a dial in the back to make his arm move, as I mentioned earlier. There were also arm wrestling sets, and every kid that saw the movie in the 80s immediately went out and arm wrestled all their friends. Again, I never won. Not once. The movie itself, though, despite all the hype and the kids that loved it, was a hopeless flop at the box office. This was even though the fact that Cannon had launched a marketing bonanza for it, including a few music videos, one of which, of course, was for Sammy Hagar's Winner Takes It All, which ends with him arm wrestling and winning against Stallone. The Kenny Loggins track, Meet Me Halfway, went on to become kind of a classic and hit number 11 on the charts, but the movie simply cratered at the box office, earning a measly $11.5 million in North America. Hugely embarrassing for Stallone because he had gotten paid $12 million to be in it. One has to assume that VHS rentals were brisk, however, and it became a constant staple of cable TV on the 80s and 90s. And sure enough, since then, it must have made a ton of money because I think it's considered quite a popular library title for Cannon and for Warner Brothers. The film being a flop, of course, didn't really hurt Sly's career too much, although it did take a hit. The next year, Rambo 3 would be a modest box office disappointment, with Tango and Cash his only real hit until a major comeback in 1993 with Rennie Harlin's Cliffhanger. For Cannon, it was one of three would-be 1987 blockbusters that crashed and burned, with the others being Masters of the Universe and Superman 4: The Quest for Peace.
Destroy Superman.
Later. He's a little bit anxious.
By the decade's end, they would again be out of business, and Golan never directed another film that was on the level of Over the Top again. Despite being a flop and Sly's apparently low opinion of it, to me Over the Top is a classic, as it was my introduction to the man and holds a special place in my Sly fandom. I give it about a 9 out of 10 Stallones. Is it perfect? No, but it's also pretty damn good despite everyone telling you differently. Without Sly, it probably wouldn't have been any good at all, but he gives it a soul, and you know what? I love this movie.
The world beats nobody halfway. If you want it, you gotta take it. You weren't talking about me. You were talking about yourself, weren't you?
What do you get when you pair two of the biggest action stars of the 80s with a mega producer known for excess and an acclaimed director who wants to make an art movie? The answer is one of the most expensive and excessive films of the 80s, but one that will always be beloved because it pairs two buddy cops named Tango and Cash.
This is insane, you know.
Very insane. Think he's telling the truth?
I don't know, but it's not raining, and he's standing in a puddle.
Disgusting.
You know, Potato Head, you just fell for the oldest routine in the book. Bad cop?
Worst cop. Did you sleep with my sister?
Oh, I don't believe you.
Did you bump uglies with my sister?
Bump uglies.
Did you?
Hey, listen, I was so drunk, I don't remember, okay? Come on, worst cop, we're late.
The late 80s were a rough time for Sylvester Stallone. In late 1989, he was coming off of three movies that made less than expected: Over the Top, Rambo 3, and Lock Up. Of the three, the only one that couldn't be called a total flop was the third Rambo, as it made a ton of money internationally, but domestically, it underwhelmed. A surefire hit was needed, so Stallone opted to make the big-budget, popcorn action flick Tango and Cash, which would team him with another action movie icon, Kurt Russell, and would be one of the few bright spots for Stallone until launching a major comeback with Cliffhanger in 1993, because it would be after this movie that Stallone would perhaps make the biggest mistake of his career: try comedy in not one but two movies.
What you did to my gun, Mom?
Nothing. I cleaned it.
What do you mean, Mom? You didn't clean it. You ruined it. I mean, you took all the bluing off it.
Clorox? That's great, Mom. If I use this gun, it's gonna blow up in my hand now.
Yet even Tango and Cash had a troubled production history with a last-minute recut and reshoots that made the film exceed its budget by a whopping $20 million.
You guys are in deep shit. Oh, shit.
Really?
And it was considered a wet print when shipped to theaters, meaning it had only just made its release date because the editing was happening going up to the 11th hour. So it gives. Why was Tango and Cash such a drama behind the scenes? Enter two of Warner Brothers' biggest producers of the era, John Peters and Peter Guber. The men responsible for Tim Burton's Batman, they made big, colorful commercial movies and probably smelt a surefire hit when they signed Stallone to star in this buddy cop movie, with the genre being one of the dominant action movie trends of the 80s thanks to movies like 48 Hours and Lethal Weapon.
Tell me a story.
Fuck you.
Oh, that's one of my favorites.
Which makes the choice of directors questionable at best. To helm Tango and Cash, they hired Andrei Konchalovsky, the Russian director of Runaway Train. Konchalovsky had left the Soviet Union sometime earlier and was a student of directors like Akira Kurosawa or Andrei Tarkovsky. He could direct the hell out of action, one need only look at his film Runaway Train to see that, but he didn't exactly have a light touch. Somewhere during the shoot, reportedly near the end, Konchalovsky was fired and replaced by the director of Purple Rain, Albert Magnoli. If you watch Tango and Cash, with its ultra-stylish montages and musical numbers, it does indeed feel more like an Albert Magnoli film. But who knows who is responsible for what in the final cut. It's all such a mess, I feel like nobody, even the editor Stuart Baird, who essentially saved the movie, would know. DP Barry Sonnenfeld was also replaced at some time during the production, apparently at Stallone's request, by his DP from Lockup, Donald Thorin, who also shot, of course, Magnoli's Purple Rain. Things were not helped by the fact that John Peters and Peter Guber were caught up in a brutal lawsuit with the distributor Warner Brothers before it hit theaters, and the two were slamming the studio and the press before it came out for rushing its release. Although, to Warner Brothers' credit, I think perhaps the reason they put it out so soon was that they were riding an amazing wave at the box office in 1989 with Batman and Lethal Weapon 2 huge hits. Even something like Driving Miss Daisy was a big hit for them, so I can imagine they probably thought that they could do some magic with Tango and Cash. And sure enough, the movie did pretty well at the box office.
We're on fire!
Yeah, we're cooking now!
You'd think, given how troubled it was, Tango and Cash would turn out to be a disaster, but actually it wasn't. Despite everything, the film was a decent-sized hit at Christmas of 1989. What makes the movie work so well is that despite everything that happened off-screen, the film is a blast, with Stallone and Russell having awesome action movie chemistry.
Well, what do you think?
I think with your IQ, you're unarmed and still very dangerous.
Okay, Sherlock Holmes, if you're so goddamn smart, you tell me who set us up.
I don't know yet.
Yeah, you don't know shit.
Russell was apparently not the first choice for the role, with him only landing the part after Patrick Swayze dropped out to do Roadhouse.
I thought you'd be bigger.
Opinions vary.
Swayze would have been good, but he doesn't have the same smart-ass vibe that Russell brought to the role of Gabriel Cash.
Well, if you don't make it back, and I do, I am gonna date your sister.
The casting is really interesting, as both guys were super alpha males at the top of their game, even if Stallone at this point was a much bigger star. Russell had already been in several John Carpenter cult classics, but two of those movies, The Thing and Big Trouble in Little China, had been flops, only to become classics later on. He had a modest hit in the romantic comedy Overboard, opposite his partner Goldie Hawn, but in 1989 he was not a top star. In fact, he was probably best known as being the guy that lived with Goldie Hawn, who was a much bigger star than he was at that time. His stardom would come a little bit later, when movies like Unlawful Entry, Tombstone, and Stargate made him a top draw, and indeed, Kurt Russell is one of the most beloved actors of all time.
You tell him I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Even still, Cash is at least equal in screen time to Tango. He plays the edgier part here, with Cash the street-smart cop who rocks a Henley with the neck cut out in true 80s movie style, while Stallone is a more polished suit, being a slick cop who dresses like a stockbroker, is independently wealthy, and plays cop for excitement.
I don't understand you. You make a shitload of money, you dress like a banker. What are you doing this for?
Action.
Action?
Good old American action.
Kurt Russell's Cash even gets the love interest, Terry Hatcher, long before she was ever on Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman. She plays an exotic dancer named Alex, who is actually Tango's baby sister, and does a whole Flashdance style routine set to Yazoo's Don't Go, which is a very 80s moment, but also kind of cool. The movie also has a lot of fun with the homoerotic content, more so than you'd think for 1989, with both men often appearing shirtless or in tiny undershirts while the two share a memorable, funny shower scene together when they compare penis sizes.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
Relax. Soap. And don't flatter yourself, Pee-wee.
Kurt Russell even wears drag at one point. Despite the fact that at least 2 directors were involved, the movie holds together well as a comic book style action flick, almost existing as a spoof of the buddy cop formula. Jack Palance is the main villain, a drug lord named Yves Perret, who I suppose is supposed to be French, but he has no accent at all.
If it isn't Tango, it's Cash. Tango and Cash, Cash and Tango. These 2 cops are driving me crazy.
Who frames the 2 super cops to get them out of the way, sending them to a brutal prison that they escape from pretty quickly. However, the movie is utterly stolen by the late Brian James, who affects a Cockney accent as Palance's cold-blooded henchman.
I'll cut your bloody throat. Yank your thing at the O and tie the lovely Windsor knot for you, eh?
I don't wear ties, that's him.
Nothing in the movie even borders on realism, with Tango and Cash's railroading into a super maximum security prison kinda tough to swallow. Kurt Russell's Gabriel Cash even has a Q-like weapons guy played by Michael J. Pollard, who arms the 2 to the teeth in the climax and gives them a tricked-out ride to use on their assault on Perret's headquarters. The score is by Harold Faltermeyer, who was perhaps the biggest composer of the 80s, doing the soundtracks for Beverly Hills Cop and Top Gun. In the end, Tango and Cash was demolished by critics, but also wasn't the box office flop that many thought it would be. Given how high the cost had gone for the film, it earned its budget back in North America and was a huge hit overseas and on video, to the point that a sequel could have happened at one point, and indeed could still happen, I suppose, further down the line, although Russell and Stallone are getting a bit long in tooth perhaps to be playing Tango and Cash still in the police force. It's definitely one of Stallone's most fun 80s flicks, with some great action scenes such as an opening sequence involving a truck full of cocaine and a gun that he lifted from pal Jackie Chan's Police Story. While it all makes very little sense, it's still a very fun flick that I give 8 out of 10 Stallones. But beware our next 2 installments, because we are going to dig deep into Stallone's misguided attempt at becoming a comedy star with not 1 but 2 movies, either of which did particularly well. Oscar, directed by John Landis.
How did 50 grand change your underwear? That's what I'm asking you! Maybe it was a miracle. You know, like the loaves and the fishes.
And the infamous Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, starring Golden Gal Estelle Getty.
She was. You shot him.
No shit.
Yes, this was actually my first Stallone movie that I ever saw in a movie theater, so that should be an episode to keep an eye out for.